It's my pleasure today to introduce Steve Davis. I've known Steve's work for quite a long time. He did his dissertation with Ken Caldera at the Carnegie Institution on Stanford's campus, and also worked with another close colleague, Chris Field. Really interesting background. So Steve has, I guess, a background in the spirit of the interdisciplinary nature of the Nicholas School, a bachelor's degree in political science and philosophy, University of Florida, and then a J.D. from the Virginia Law School. So after getting his law degree, he worked for a while, and then went back to grad school, in this case for geology and environmental sciences, which he completed at Stanford. So you don't meet too many lawyer PhD geologists. So Steve, today is talking about the human drivers of climate change, but he has a couple of research interests that sort of have snaked their way through his research record. He's interested in the socioeconomic drivers of climate change in particular, linkages among human demand for energy, goods, and agricultural products. Done a lot of work on embedded emissions, which we may hear about today, emissions in traded products, for instance, what we consume from other countries. Has worked in the area of commitments to future emissions based on infrastructure that is in place now or is about to be built. So looking at sort of projecting the lifetime of emissions of different technologies and what we're already in for with the current technologies on the ground. And also, more recently, intensification of agriculture and to some extent biofuels. On the side, he's co-founded a couple of NGOs, one called Near Zero, which he's currently chief scientist for, and they look at energy technologies. He was just telling me before the seminar, including expert solicitations. And then, while he was a grad student, also founded another nonprofit called the Climate Conservancy with a couple of other folks, which he said is winding up, but he's the executive director for that. So I think that's enough. Stays busy. So today he'll tell us about human drivers of climate change, energy, economic growth, and trade.
Thanks very much, Rob, for that. And thanks for having me here today, everyone. So, as Rob said, the title of the talk is about human drivers of climate change, and I'll start out by just going through a quick overview of what I'll talk about. The first thing I'm going to show you is just a big picture perspective of how I think about the human dimensions of global environmental change and climate change in particular. And then I'll get into some background of recent important trends in emissions and energy use, and that'll be useful. It'll probably be review for a lot of you, but it'll be useful when I go into the discussion of the recent work that I've done in two particular topics, both of which Rob actually mentioned in his introduction. But one is the emissions that are embodied in international trade and the policy implications thereof. And then secondly, what I call the infrastructural inertia of emissions, or as Rob said, the emissions that we're in for based on the currently existing infrastructure. And finally, I'll wrap up with some discussion of a couple of areas that I'm interested in pursuing research in the future. So this is what I call the vicious cycle, and it helps me to have a little framework about the entire area of global environmental change and how my research should be directed or applies. And so it all starts here at the top with the desire for improved well-being, something common to everyone on the planet. And oftentimes that desire for improved well-being leads to a demand for goods and services, which in turn typically entails access to energy services or energy. And because 86% of primary energy on the planet comes from fossil fuels, that energy usually leads to CO2 emissions. And because the CO2 emissions are happening at a rate that's faster than they can be taken up by the biosphere of the oceans, that leads to an accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. And of course, in turn, the radiative forcing of that CO2 causes negative impacts on the climate and the oceans, which are going to reduce our well-being, and we're back at the beginning where we started. And so part of the reason I like to lay it out this way is that I think it nicely organizes the different ways that we have to attack this problem. And so, for instance, I'll go through these a little bit. If you, instead of demanding goods and services when you want improved well-being, you deny yourself those things. Maybe you take a staycation or you put on a sweater instead of turning up the thermostat. That's conservation. And along the next link, if when you demand goods and services, you're able to do that without as much energy requirements, that's efficiency. You've bought yourself a Prius or something of that nature. If the demand for energy doesn't lead to CO2 emissions, this is the most popular one, obviously. You're getting energy from carbon-free or low-carbon sources, nuclear and renewables. If the CO2 emissions occur, it's possible that with the carbon capture and storage technologies that Professor Pratson would tell you about, you can not have those accumulate in the atmosphere. If they do accumulate in the atmosphere, there's a whole new suite of strategies that's being discussed now for how to actually avert the negative impacts on the environment, and those are known as geoengineering approaches. If the negative impacts do materialize, of course, it's possible that we might be able to adapt to some of those and so not experience quite such a reduction in our well-being. And then this last arrow here, the one I haven't labeled, you might call suffering. So I'm going to talk today about some work that I've done on this side of the circle labeled mitigation. And the reason I put this up here is to just give you the big picture, as I said, but also to show that my research interests really span the entirety of this cycle. One last thing before I leave this slide is, although I've couched this in terms of energy and CO2 emissions, you could just as easily imagine this sort of cycle applying to land use or land use change, things like that. So to dive into some background, this is a long-term trend of global CO2 emissions since 1960. And you can see here, of course, that these have been increasing for a long time, apart from some minor blips where mostly to do with global economic crises. But what I want to draw your attention to is that beginning in about 2002 or 2003, so about a decade ago, there's a change in the slope of this curve, and there's been a surge in these emissions. And so I want to explore that a little bit with you because it applies to some of the work that I'm doing. So, lest there are any Malthusians in the audience who are saying, I know what the problem is, there's too many people, right? I've been to California. That's not the whole story, and this plot's showing us that. This is per capita emissions since 1990, and what it's showing you is that in the same period of time as we have those surging emissions, you also see there's a strong uptick in the global average per capita emissions. So while it's probably true, or definitely true, that growing population is contributing to this increase in emissions, this plot shows us that's certainly not the only thing going on. This is a very simple but useful equation that I'm enamored with called the Kaya identity, and some of you are probably familiar with it. But I find it's very useful for decomposing the various drivers of fossil fuel emissions. And what it's showing us here is that global fossil fuel emissions, F, are set equal to population times GDP per capita times energy intensity of GDP times the carbon intensity of energy. And so I'll just walk through these very quickly and talk about, of these four factors that are equal to fossil fuel emissions, which of these might be levers for us to use to reduce global emissions. And so to start, population. We've already mentioned that, but short of authoritarian policies that limit childbirth, which aren't wildly popular, it's very difficult to govern population. And demographers will tell you that if you really want to slow the growth rate of population, the best way to do that is to actually increase this second term, GDP per capita. And that's because people tend to have more children, the less certain the survival of their children is. And so GDP per capita is a good proxy for the sort of health services and things that people have access to. So then, if we can't decrease population or control it very well, what about GDP per capita? Well, whether you're looking to buy a new BMW or just feed your family, pretty much every person on the planet is looking for that term to go up. And while it might be something for us to sit here and say that our neighbors shouldn't be making any more money, it's pretty clear that at least for the several billion poorest people on the planet, that it's desirable for that number to increase. And so the global average GDP per capita, for the reasons I've mentioned, is most likely going to continue increasing, and we want that. So that leaves us with these last two terms, which are the main two ways that we can try to limit fossil fuel emissions in the long run. The first is energy intensity of GDP. And so you can think of this as how efficient are we being with our energy use in terms of converting that into economic value. And the second is the carbon intensity of energy, which is really sort of the carbon-weighted average of the fuels that we're burning to provide energy, such that if we generate more energy from renewable sources and nuclear, then that term goes down. So I like to ask audiences whether, as between those two terms, which of them they could ever imagine approaching zero, because in fact that's what actually has to happen if we're going to stabilize our climate system. And it's a bit of a rhetorical question, because I would argue that while I think we can become increasingly efficient, I don't think we're ever going to have a robust economy that uses no energy. So this is showing those 4 Kaya terms that we just walked through and the time trend since between 1980 and 2004, I guess. And they're all normalized to equal 1 in 1990. It's a bit of a dated plot, but I think it gets the message across, and it starts to explain why that uptick in the acceleration in the growth rate of CO2 emissions globally. So what you see here is F, the black line, has been increasing for a long time, and you can make out this shift in the trajectory there towards the end. P, which is red, is the population, which has been growing monotonically. The orange line is GDP per capita, which, as we said, is mostly up, and short of a few economic setbacks here and there. But the two that I want to draw your attention to are these 2 important levers that we just talked about. The light blue is the carbon intensity of energy, and the green is the energy intensity of GDP. And what you see here is that although the long-term trend has been that these things have been coming down, roughly 1% a year historically, but what's interesting about this plot is that it shows you pretty clearly that there's been at least a stagnation, if not, in this case, you can actually see an increase in those 2 terms. So what's going on? Why the long-term decrease that suddenly is reversed? Let's dig into that a bit. Now, this plot starts to explain why the energy intensity of the global economy has increased lately. And what it's showing you is global emissions since 1990 divided into 2 bins. One is the Annex B, the developed rich countries like the US, Japan, and Europe, and non-Annex B countries of the developing world like China and India. And so what you see is that the developed countries' emissions have been relatively stable, pretty flat, whereas there's been tremendous growth, particularly in this last decade, in the developing countries like China. And so this in and of itself doesn't entirely explain why the energy intensity of the global economy is increasing, but if you reflect on what you know about what sort of development is occurring in these 2 sets of countries, then you can start understanding what's happening. And it's because the growth that's occurring, the economic boom going on in the developing countries, tends to be very energy intensive. They're manufacturing things, they're building buildings, whereas cutting hair and drafting legal documents, not so much increase here in the developed world. So that tells us why the energy intensity of the global economy is increasing. What about the carbon intensity? It's a similar plot that breaks out global emissions into the different fossil fuels that are used to generate energy, as well as cement here at the bottom. But what you see is that while gas and oil have been slowly increasing over time, it's coal that in the recent decade has really taken off and is now responsible for more emissions than oil. And so this is the second part of the story, why carbon intensity of energy is increasing, and that's because that energy intensive development in countries like China is being fueled by coal, which is the most carbon intensive of fossil fuels. And so we've pretty neatly explained why this sudden increase in the growth rate of emissions, haven't we? We know, well, it's these economic boom in developing countries that happens to be energy intensive, and it's being fueled by coal, and so that's that. But I'm going to shift gears and talk about some work I've done that frankly complicates that picture a little bit. And so I think the way I like to lay this out is it's one thing to talk about the emissions that are coming out of a smokestack of a plant that's making widgets. But what if those widgets are loaded on a ship like the one I show here, sent across the ocean and consumed in some place like Raleigh? Who's responsible for those emissions? And I don't mean to get into an ethical debate about whether consumers or producers are responsible for global harms. I think that's beyond the scope of what I've done, although it's certainly something that comes up when I talk about this. But rather, it's to say that there's clearly a benefit on the part of those consumers for the emissions that are happening in distant lands. And so how you allocate those can make a big difference in this picture that I've been painting. So to dig into that and to clarify some terminology, first off, where emissions occur, which is something I'll call production emissions throughout the talk, and where goods and services are ultimately consumed, which is what I'll call consumption emissions, are often 2 different things, separated by oceans many times. So I wanted to actually calculate the difference there between production and consumption emissions on a global level and to see how significant this component of international trade was. And so how do I do that? How do I set about measuring embodied emissions in global trade? And so luckily enough for me, there was an economist by the name of Wassily Leontiev that back in the 70s won a Nobel Prize for coming up with what we now call input-output modeling. And I'll walk you through a simple example. Actually, it comes from one of his early books so you can understand. What we have here is a matrix that he called the technology matrix A. And what it's showing us is, for this very simple three-sector economy of farming, construction, and clothing, how many units of the row sector are required to produce 1 unit of the column sector. And so this is presented sort of as fractions, but in practice this could be any unit. It could be actual bales of hay, bars of steel, and shirts, and it works the same way. But this technology matrix is defining the interactions of sectors in an economy, and it gets at what's called intermediate demand, which is to say what other industries are consuming of what their fellow industries are producing. And it's as opposed to final demand, which is what you and I might go to Walmart and buy. And so what he was able to define, and it's a fairly straightforward arithmetic, is that for any total production in the economy, some of that is going to final demand, but some of that is also going to intermediate demand. And it's just a pretty simple subtraction there once you have this matrix that describes the interactions of all the units. Where it gets interesting, though, is that he figured out if you invert that technology matrix, then it lets you specify a final demand that you're interested in and see where in the world other sectors have to produce goods to meet that final demand. And so if you have a huge matrix, a huge technology matrix that includes not just clothing and farming, but things like American motor vehicles, Chinese steel, and Russian plastics, then you can start doing the sort of analysis that I was interested in. And so we relied on a large data set that's put out by Purdue University called the Global Trade Analysis Project. And it divides the world into 113 regions, which are mostly countries, but there are some aggregated regions. And it also has 57 discrete industry sectors. And the version that I used in the initial analysis is using 2004 data. It's a little dated, but the assembly of this kind of data set takes time, I guess. And so we inverted this enormous matrix, which takes a while on the computer, but it's possible. And then you go through and specify the final demand of consumers in each country in turn. And by multiplying that times this global matrix of technology and the interactions, you can see where in the world and in what sectors production has to occur in order to meet that final demand in some country. And so the last piece then to look at embodied emissions, or we actually analyzed embodied energy as well, is to get a matrix, or a vector of just the emissions that are associated with production in each of those sectors directly, which is data that's available. And so when you do that, then you can calculate exactly what sort of emissions and where and in what sectors have to occur to meet a final demand in each country. And so when you do that and you calculate the results, this is what it looks like. So what you're seeing here is obviously a world map, and the arrows drawn on here are imports and exports of emissions that are embodied in goods and services being transported between these countries. Now I should clarify that the model that we used tracks the complexities of trade, such that if something comes from China and it goes to Singapore and is repackaged or assembled with pieces from India and so forth, the way the model works, it actually captures all that complexity and assigns the emissions ultimately to wherever they're being consumed. So transshipping and things like that are accounted for. So again, the black arrows are these gross flows of embodied emissions. The colors of the countries underneath, and I've only colored the top 10 largest net importers and net exporters, are showing you the net import or export. Import in the case of the redder countries, and export in the case of the bluer countries. And so you can see here that we're living in a world where rich countries like the US, Western Europe, and Japan are importing large quantities of these embodied emissions from places like China in particular. And so, in fact, in 2004, our data concluded that 6.2 gigatons of CO2, or almost a quarter of global emissions in that year, were shipped as emissions embodied in goods and services traded internationally. So how significant are these traded emissions in terms of individual countries? Well, what I'm showing you here on the left is a bar chart of the top 10 countries where their net exports are a large fraction of the emissions that are produced in those countries. And so in China, for instance, almost 23% of the emissions that occur in China are actually associated with goods and services that get consumed outside of China. And the color of these bars is telling you something about GDP per capita in these countries. The blue is less GDP per capita, and the red are the more affluent countries. So the fact that these are all sort of purplish tells you that They're not the least developed countries. In fact, they're the emerging markets oftentimes that are heavily expanding their economies and building things. On the right, I'm showing something slightly different and a little bit more abstract. Here I'm looking at, of all the goods and services that are consumed in these different countries, what fraction of those are net imports from other countries. And so you see here there's many affluent countries that don't have much manufacturing of their own, such as Switzerland and Iceland and places. But there's also a couple of poor countries on here, and if you look at the sectors involved, you can find out that those are generally subsistence goods, food products, and things that they have to import that they don't have access to. Two that aren't on here but that are significant, they weren't in the top 10, are Japan and the US, where respectively 18 and 11% of the emissions associated with goods and services consumed in those countries is imported. So essentially what that's saying is that the average American's carbon footprint is 11% bigger than you might expect if you didn't factor in trade. So subsequently, some work's been done to actually recreate that kind of embodied emissions in trade over time, and this is showing you the trends between 1990 and 2008. And so it's a little bit complicated, but I'll walk you through it. This is similar to the plot that I showed early on of developed country emissions in the top being pretty flat and the developing countries going up. But what's new on here is that the production emissions are these thinner lines, which are at the bottom of the developed countries and the top of the developing countries. And the consumption-based accounting is now added on as these bolder lines. And so what you can see, for instance, pretty clearly in the case of the developed countries is that while the thinner production-based emissions are relatively flat, the bold line of consumption-based emissions has been increasing over time, such that this net imports has widened over time. And in fact, in this period I'm showing you, it's increased by about 7%. Which is, ironically enough, the opposite direction, but the same magnitude as the committed reduction that those countries signed up to under the Kyoto Protocol. This is telling us something about they have not only not reduced, but they've actually, if you factor in consumption, outsourced some of these emissions to developing countries. This is a similar plot, except for this time, instead of just emissions, we're looking at the CO2 intensity of GDP. So this is just saying how carbon intensive are the economies of developing countries versus developed countries. And the thing that I think is interesting here is that if you compare, for instance, these thinner lines, the production-based lines, and you draw a horizontal line across like so, you can see that the developing countries seem to be lagging the developed countries by about a decade in terms of how carbon intensive they are. But if instead you compare the bolder consumption-based lines, they're much closer together than that in reality. And in fact, maybe the developing countries are only lagging the developed countries by 4 or 5 years. So just touch on some of the policy implications of this. I should clarify that none of this is to say that international trade is somehow bad and that we'd be better off without international trade. That's ridiculous. There's comparative advantages of all these economies all around the world, and we depend upon that, and international trade is important for that reason. But what it is saying is that any carbon policy that's applicable or constraining emissions only in one region is not going to be successful necessarily, and it's going to encourage outsourcing of emissions to other countries without those kinds of constraints if it doesn't factor in these traded emissions. And so one thing I like to think about is what would happen if we tried to put some sort of global price constraint on carbon. And actually I understand there's some people at Duke who I might collaborate with on this topic of if we imposed a certain policy like that, where would the price of that carbon emission end up? Where would it be incident on the global economy? For instance, would consumers in developed countries just pay higher prices for their goods if there were a carbon tax built in? Or would they consume less, and so the supply would necessarily drop, and there would be a fall in carbon emissions, which, after all, is the point of that kind of stricture. The other wrinkle in there is actually where revenues are being collected, because when you're negotiating these things, if you're the one to impose a tax, for instance, you get to collect that revenue, which, at least in the short term, can have some benefit to offset the penalties of having a tax on carbon altogether. And so that's something that might incentivize developing countries to be the one to actually impose that tax, because at least then they get to collect the revenues from the tax. So these are the sorts of things that I like to think about as far as implications of this work go. Shifting gears away from the trade piece for a little while, I'm going to talk about the work that Rob mentioned. Climate change is such a significant problem in part because there are multiple layers of inertia that apply to the problem. On the one hand, we know that if atmospheric levels of CO2 stayed constant, there'd still be some pent-up warming in the system that would continue for a few years at least. And that's the geophysical inertia, if you will. On the other end, anyone who reads the papers lately knows that there's a lot of social and political inertia, that we can't even manage to convince people that this is a serious problem, much less adopt an effective climate policy. I was interested in sort of an intermediate level of inertia, and that is the inertia associated with infrastructure, in particular energy infrastructure that directly emits CO2. And so, using some very large data sets of power plants worldwide and vehicle sales over the last half century, I came up with some scenarios that answered the hypothetical question: if we never built another power plant or CO2 emitting device of any kind, but the ones in existence lived out their expected useful lifetime, how much emissions would come from those devices and what sort of climate change would that entail? And so this is what the emission scenario looks like. You can see these are CO2 emissions going from 2010 out into the future, and they taper off over the next 30 or 40 years. And what you're seeing in the different colors is the different sectors that these emissions are coming from, the infrastructure involved. The big red one here on the bottom is the energy infrastructure, primary energy, power plants. The next biggest is this orange slice, which is trucks, cars, buses, road transport. And then there's another big, the light blue, is industrial facilities that often have their own power plants built in. And so the colored portion is a midline scenario. I also took some more radical assumptions in either direction and came up with bounding scenarios on the upper end, which is this dashed line, and the lower end, where I assumed maybe a power plant lives 10 years more or less than what's historically been the case. And so you can see that things drop off pretty quickly here in the next 40 years, but in sum, the cumulative emissions involved here are about 500 billion tons of CO2, which is a fair chunk. Looking at the same emissions scenario, but instead broken out by where the emissions are occurring in the world, you can see something interesting here that gets back to what we've been talking about, which is that the infrastructure in China and India have this flat top out for the next 20 or so years, and that's because a lot of the infrastructure that's been deployed there is relatively new, and because these things are so long-lived, they last out. Now, I should say, for those of you that might not know, of course, power plants live a long time, and the average lifetime of a power plant is about 40 years. And what's interesting about this plot is that in the US and in Europe, these developed countries, the trajectories drop off fairly steeply, and that's to do with the fact that the infrastructure in those developed countries tends to be much older than what's going on in the developing world. For instance, I mentioned that the lifetime is 40 years. Well, in the United States, the mean age of a power plant weighted by its capacity to generate electricity is 32 years. So that would suggest that at least in the next decade, there might be a substantial turnover in energy infrastructure in this country, depending on different things. So we fed this into a climate model of intermediate complexity and came up with what sort of atmospheric CO2 response and warming that would come from these different scenarios. And what you see here is that even the uppermost scenario that I projected plateaus or peaks at CO2 levels of about 420 ppm in the atmosphere. And in terms of warming, that means about 1.4 degrees of warming at that upper scenario since the pre-industrial. And so, lest you walk out of here thinking I had no good news for you, it's this: if you believe that targets like 2 degrees, the worst climate impacts will materialize beyond that, what this is telling us is that the emissions that will get us to 2 degrees are going to come from devices that we haven't built yet. And so I think that's a heartening message, because it's at least theoretically telling us that there's still time to turn the ship. Of course, we all know that we're not going to immediately stop building fossil fuel emitting devices, and so there's every reason to think that we're going to continue building these things for years to come, and to assess how it is that we can more radically transition into low carbon energy infrastructure. So this is some follow-up work that I'm doing on the same vein, and instead of a snapshot in 2010, which is what we just looked at, this is looking back in time and looking at each year how much additional commitment we've signed on to based on the infrastructure that was built in that year. So the red is showing you on an annual basis how much additional committed emissions in terms of power plants, this is all just power plants, we've added over time from 1940 to 2010. And for comparison, I've drawn on in blue the emissions from power plants globally. And so what I think is interesting here is that the order of magnitude of these additional commitments on an annual basis is similar to the emissions that are actually happening from power plants, in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 gigatons a year. And so you can think of this with financial analogies, such as by looking at the red line here, the committed emissions, we're not just looking anymore at what the revenues are, but we're actually looking at the accounts payable, what's out in the future, looking us in the face. And similarly, because these things are of the same order of magnitude, it's as though you had a credit card and you paid $100 a month, but you also went out and charged $100 a month. You're just sort of in place, adding on to the principal, but not really paying down your debt very much. So let's talk about the future and where we may be heading and how we're doing. The next 3 plots are from a paper I'm working on that revisits something that was published in Nature back in 1998, not by me. And the paper was titled "The Energy Implications of Climate Stabilization." And so this plot is showing you between 1990 and 2050 what sort of primary power demands were projected back in that paper. The IS-92A line here that you see on top is a scenario that the IPCC came up with in the early 90s that was intended to be a business as usual scenario. So what would happen if there were no climate policy or constraints? And for now you can ignore these other black lines, but focus on this bold red line, which is what has actually been happening in reality. And what you see here is that we're continuing up just along that business as usual line, a little bit above. But the important thing to note is that while right now we're consuming about 15 terawatts of primary power a year globally, if we continue following this business as usual trajectory, we'd be up around 30 terawatts by mid-century. So a doubling of our electric demand between now and 2050, which is a little bit alarming. The second plot here in this series is showing you what carbon emissions need to do or would do under a business as usual scenario, again the IS-92A, and then in this time focus on these other black lines, which are telling you these are climate stabilization scenarios that would allow the atmospheric levels of CO2 to stabilize at those different levels. So for instance, if we follow this bottom line, it'd be possible to stabilize atmospheric CO2 at 350 ppm. Again, the bold red line is showing you what's actually happened, and you can see that we're out above the business as usual scenario and sort of rising steeply. Certainly not trending on any of these downward paths like 450 or even tapering off like the 550 stabilization scenario suggests. This is sort of a bad sign. The last of these 3 plots is showing you what sort of carbon-free or low-carbon sources of energy would need to be deployed to meet that first plot's energy demand, but also comply with the emission strictures of that second plot I showed you. And so you can see in this case it's reversed. The business as usual scenario assumed a certain growth of renewable and carbon-free primary power, whereas the more aggressive climate stabilization scenarios have carbon-free primary power really taken off over the next 40, 50 years. And here again, the bold red line disappoints a bit. It's relatively flat, and it's not even keeping up with the projected business as usual scenario, which shows us that we're sort of behind a bit. So, based on the infrastructural analysis that I showed you and these plots, I'm at once excited that we're working on a problem that there is some opportunity to still do something and pass some policies that can enable us, hopefully, to transition our energy system in a smart way. But so far, it's not looking like we're following a good path. And so I think this is a really important message to highlight for folks in government and business that are trying to make decisions about these things. So now I'm going to turn to some work that I'm interested in doing in the future. The first of which is to actually move away from fossil fuel emissions altogether and do that sort of trade analysis that I explained to you, but instead looking at land use change. So just in the same way as we can follow the fossil fuel emissions that are embodied in goods and services, it should be possible to follow the land use change and land use emissions that are effectively embodied in an agricultural product. And so I've got a little picture here of some forest being cleared in the Amazon with fire and products that may result from that, beef or sugar. So one of the tricks of doing this sort of thing is that while fossil fuel emissions all happen at one time when the fuel is burned, land use change emissions are a little trickier than that because they happen over a period of time. And so I've got some just hypothetical schematics here of what I'm talking about to explain the complexity. On the top here is a cartoon of what land use change emissions might happen if we cleared a parcel of land. There's going to be a time period when organic matter in the soil decomposes and biomass decomposes, and so there's emissions happening. And then that'll taper off eventually, and if there's ever an abandonment of that parcel of land, then the landscape would start taking up carbon again. And so these things might actually take very long, decades long, to occur. On the bottom here, and in the sort of the same, it's meant to line up in time, the same period between the clearing and the abandonment, there might be cultivation, which could result in its own agricultural emissions, such as nitrous oxide from fertilizers. So the challenge then is to allocate these emissions to a specific product that's grown on that parcel of land that was cleared. And so just again to walk through an example of why that might be difficult, I've shown here in the highlighted bars, say for instance the first few years after the clearing, sugarcane was grown on the land and then transitioned to soybeans, and then after abandonment maybe we credit forestry for that uptake of emissions. One opportunity if you're trying to allocate to products is to allocate to the products according to what we think was happening in the carbon cycle. So in this case, sugarcane would look pretty bad. It's getting a ton of these emissions that happened after the clearing, whereas soybeans would look pretty great in terms of the land use change emissions entailed there. Now something seems fundamentally wrong with that. In terms of the point of this analysis would be to get at the economic drivers of these land use and land use change patterns. And so it's not very likely that a farmer in Brazil is contemplating the vagaries of the carbon cycle when he or she decides to buy a parcel of land and clear it for agriculture. More likely, he or she's thinking about the economic return on the investment of buying that land and growing crops on it. So perhaps a better thing to do would be to take an arbitrary period of time that we think that farmer is thinking about when they make a decision and equalize the total emissions from the landscape over that period of time. Another way of doing it would actually be to use something like the net present value of money and assume that the farmer is valuing the early crops from the landscape slightly more than the later crops, and so allocate the emissions in some sort of a discount rate. So this is not to get into the details too much, but just to get you a flavor of the accounting that goes into these kinds of analyses and why it might be a little more complex for the land use case. In essence, all accounting systems are human artifacts. There's nothing natural about them. They might be more or less useful for different purposes, but this is where the natural world has to be translated into something that can be used by policymakers. And the kinds of things that might come out of this analysis, this is just some hypothetical, mostly in units. If we were to track these land use and land use change emissions through trade, we could say something, for instance, about the different carbon intensities of land use in different regions of the world. And then also, since we've assigned those to specific products, you could say something about the carbon intensity of products that are being produced or consumed in different countries and what sort of trade was entailed. So for instance, if you're eating a steak and it was from a Brazilian cow, you could say something about the land use intensity that had to go on in Brazil in order to bring you that steak. And that's what I'm showing here on this map at the bottom. We could come up with totals of what sort of trade in land use change emissions effectively are going on globally. So another area that I'm interested in doing some research, the second of the two that I'll talk about, is involving the relationship between energy and human development. And so it's going to be awfully hard for you guys to read this, I'm sorry, but I'll explain what I'm showing here. These are 6 plots of different human development indicators, which are all on the y-axis, and regressed against, on the x-axis, the electricity consumed per capita in each case. All on the same x scale, too, by the way. And so what you see here is that literacy rate and the persistence to the last grade of primary education, child and infant mortality, poverty, access to improved sanitation, all of these things correlate very nicely with electricity consumption per capita. And so using these regressions, you can come up with an estimate of what kind of electrical consumption is implied by human development goals like the Millennium Development Plan. So I'd like to come up with a set of those scenarios that try to maximize or at least reach the quantitative goals of the Millennium Development Plan. And then isolate, depending on which fossil fuels are being used or what fuels in general or energy sources are being used to meet that electrical demand, what kinds of emissions we might be talking about. And the reason I think this is critical is that even on these plots, if you take you're on the plateau of most of these things at about 5,000 kilowatt hours per year per person. But if you're talking about 3 billion people with limited or no access to electricity globally, and a common average carbon intensity of electricity generation, you're talking about billions of tons of CO2 per year entailed in that development. And so this is to say that even if carbon emissions in the developed world were to stop today, if developing countries rely on carbon-intensive fossil fuels for their energy as they develop, even to meet these fairly minimal development goals, we're still going to be faced with a significant climate problem. And just for comparison, we're talking about 5,000 kilowatt hours per year per person. In the US, the average is 90,000, so substantially bigger. So obviously, it doesn't even need to be said that if these developing countries pursue a path of development all the way to the point where they're using energy as heedlessly as the US residents are, then we're going to be in a world of hurt if they're using fossil fuels. And so I'd like to, again, come up with some scenarios for how those emissions might look or change depending on what development goals may be and which fossil fuels or energy sources are used to meet those demands. And then feed those into a climate model and actually come up with some scenarios of what climate impacts are implied by human development goals. That was kind of short-term work. In the longer term, I'm actually interested in going into the field and looking at some of the economic impacts of the new access to electricity that's happening in a lot of these developing countries. I think it's a critical area to understand exactly how energy and energy services translate into economic growth. And there's an opportunity right now because a lot of the countries of the world, as well as the UN, are focused on this issue of bringing electricity to places that have not had access to this point. So I have envisioned working with some applied economists to go into these areas and actually look at villages, for instance, that have or have not had recent access to electricity and see what sort of economic consequences that access has produced. All of which brings us pretty nicely back to my cycle. And the one constant here, again, is the desire for improved well-being. And so I think it's a really exciting time to be working in this field when there's so many different options on the table for how to come at this problem and which of these links can be broken or at least weakened. Because it's really what we do in the next 50 years that's going to determine what sort of climate impacts we have to contend with and how bad this last link, the suffering, will be. I think I left time for some questions here.